Sweet breath, buildings big enough to be seen from space, hippo hunting. That's the ancient Egyptians for us. A civilization so wealthy that they not only buried their dead, but their slaves along with them. Mind you, they were people who liked to keep things in the family. Literally. We used to think we knew all about the land of the pyramids, but mysteries remain, from elaborate booby traps to the mystery behind the final resting place of the pharaoh that built the Great Pyramid of Giza. Here are some amazing revelations we found out relatively recently about ancient Egypt. Number 10. The Great Sphinx's Age. It's one of the most recognizable icons of ancient Egypt, but the Great Sphinx remains full of mystery and unanswered questions. Most Egyptologists believe it was built during the reign of Khafre or Khafre about 4,500 years ago, around the same time as the Second Pyramid of Giza. The sculpture, with the head of a human and the body of a lion, was carved from one single slab of limestone, making it one of the largest single stone statues ever created. The biggest question about the Sphinx is when and why it was made. The full body was only fully uncovered in 1905 when the sand that covered it was removed, and we have no idea how it suffered from such extensive damage, such as where its nose went. The water erosion hypothesis points to the weathering effect that can be seen on the walls of the structure. While many suggest the erosion was caused by sand, notable and renowned geologists like Robert M. Schoch from Boston University have concluded it could only have been caused by centuries of heavy rainfall because of the direction and characteristics of the grooves. If true, this would suggest the Sphinx is much older than we thought, possibly suggesting it was created by a lost civilization during the last period of significant rainfall around 5,000 years ago. Was there an advanced civilization that predated the Egyptians? Or did the Sphinx have more of an important role to the early Egyptians than previously known? We may never find out for sure, but archaeologists are dedicating their careers to discovering the answer. Number 9. Inventions we only just discovered they came up with first. We like to think we live in the most advanced times and are able to take advantage of inventions that have changed the world. But there are a number of things that we take for granted that the Egyptians had access to thousands of years ago, and we've only recently discovered they came up with them first. They had toothpaste, for example, which had very different ingredients than it does today, but still achieved similar effects. One recipe that was found written on papyrus from the 4th century AD details a powder for white and perfect teeth that contained rock salt, mint, dried iris flower, and grains of pepper. The Egyptians were also responsible for the calendar we use today. They did this by observing the star Sirius in the eastern sky, which would appear in the same place at a time that coincided with the flooding of the Nile. This led to the creation of a 365-day calendar, split into 12 months of 30 days with 5 days of festivals at the end. Initially, they didn't take into account the slight variations in the yearly cycle, and their calendar gradually became incorrect, something they resolved during the reign of Ptolemy III by adding a leap day every 4 years. The Egyptians also used cosmetic makeup as far back as 4,000 years ago. They also had wigs, surgical instruments, clocks, and even police, who were armed with staffs and dogs and would punish criminals in a number of brutal ways, including cutting off their ears and nose to prevent them from entering the afterlife. Number 8. The complete process of mummification. One of the most fascinating things about the ancient Egyptians was the way they mummified bodies. The process itself was an ingenious way to preserve bodies and in their minds prepare them for the afterlife. The process began in a building called an ibu, the place of purification, where embalmers washed the body with palm wine and water from the Nile. Next, the parts of the body that began to decompose first were removed. This involved cutting open the left side of the body and removing the internal organs like the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines. They were washed and left to dry out, but crucially, the heart was left in place because this was believed to be the center of intelligence and needed in the afterlife. A long hook was inserted through the nose and used to break the brain into small pieces so it could be removed. Then the body was covered in natron to dry it out. After 45 days, the body was washed again. The dried organs were wrapped in linen and returned to the body, along with sawdust and leaves to make it appear lifelike. The last step was to wrap the body in linen, which would use enough material to stretch out almost a mile long. The mummification process evolved over the years, and there were a number of variations that have been seen, but the main elements were consistent throughout and led to the creation of the most poignant Egyptian artifacts to ever be found. Number 7. King Tut was deformed. King Tut married his half-sister, and incest was quite common within the ruling families of Egypt. His own parents were either cousins or siblings, and he suffered from various conditions as a result of this. His own children failed to live beyond infanthood because of genetic abnormalities caused by the limited gene pool. He had an untreatable clubfoot, which meant that he was unable to walk without the assistance of a cane. He had weak bones because of a condition called Kohler's disease, a pronounced overbite, he had unusually wide hips, and was developing breasts. It's likely that despite dying by the age of 19, he would have been in incredible pain as a result of the deformations. And there's useful evidence to understand how his life would have been. Rather than being an all-powerful sun god, racing in chariots and living a life of luxury, he would have been frail and weak and struggled to move around. Number 6. The pyramids were not built by slaves. The pyramids are some of the most impressive buildings to have ever been constructed. But contrary to popular belief, they weren't actually built by slaves. The idea of a vast slave class in Egyptian society comes from Judeo-Christian traditions, but inscriptions within the pyramids themselves paint a different picture. Excavations of nearby locations have revealed the existence of the pyramid cities, where those who worked on their construction lived. Estimates of how many people involved vary, from the thousands to the hundreds of thousands. But they were laborers and not slaves as such. In the past few decades, the evidence has multiplied, as in 1990, graves of the builders were found by a tourist. The finds have convinced Egypt's chief archaeologist Zahi Hawass that they were paid laborers rather than slaves. According to archaeologist Mark Lenner, Egyptian society had a strict hierarchy, similar to a feudal system. Everyone owed Bak to someone higher up in the chain to themselves, and it's likely it was this Bak that forced large numbers to work on the great projects. Bak, though, isn't the same as slavery. After all, even the most influential officials owed Bak to someone else. It's more like the way that responsibility and loyalty were shown in Egyptian society, and was in many ways crucial to the Egyptians being far more advanced than any other civilizations at the time. Number 5. Antibiotics. Egyptian medicine was incredibly advanced, even if they didn't fully understand the chemistry behind their treatments. A study in 2010 of ancient Egyptian bones by Emory University found out that they used antibiotics, for example, to treat infections, often through their beer or feeding moldy bread to patients to help them recover. That means they knew about antibiotics 2,000 years prior to us, as we only recently rediscovered this method in 1928 when Alexander Fleming isolated penicillin. The Egyptians also frequently performed dentistry, with specialized doctors being responsible for removing infected teeth and replacing them with bridges. And they would bandage wounds, give stitches, knew how to fix dislocated arms and legs, and how to heal broken bones. Perhaps the most frightening Egyptian medical technique, though, can be seen in the artwork from the time. As you can see here, they actually performed complex eye surgeries too. Number 4. How King Tut died. King Tutankhamun is undoubtedly the most famous of Egyptian pharaohs, following the discovery of his almost perfectly intact tomb in 1922 by Howard Carter. King Tut ascended to the throne of Egypt in 1333 BC at the age of 9 or 10 and was dead by the age of 19. His tomb reignited the world's interest in Egyptology, but the mysterious case of his death has only recently been amended. The circumstances around his death aren't documented, so we're left to look at his remains and infer what happened. Some theorize that because of his young age and injuries to the side of his body, he died in an accident, perhaps due to an encounter with a hippo or as a result of a chariot accident. A study from 2014 even suggested his death was due to his genetic defects from incest and being infected from malaria, as he wouldn't have been able to stand on a chariot with his clubbed foot. Whatever the cause, his tomb showed signs of being rushed, which meant that the timing of his death caught everyone by surprise. Number 3. Squishing heads. If this sounds bizarre, it's because it is. Called cranial deformation, the ancient Egyptians carried out this strange practice so their skulls could fit snugly inside long, narrow hats, because this was their version of swag. Only joking, they weren't that cool. Thanks to recent work by Dr. Robert Martin, we have some rather conclusive evidence to suggest that ancient Egyptian royalty practiced artificial head binding to distort the shape of their heads. While most researchers up until recently thought that ancient Egyptian murals of figures with long heads were simply for artistic style, the truth is quite conclusive this wasn't entirely the case. The elite of society deliberately set out from birth to tightly bind baby skulls in different ways. Since a baby's head is flexible for the first couple of years, the skull would adapt to the shape and settle in a distinctive shape. Various computer scans of pharaohs, like one of King Tutankhamun, provides evidence that they experienced cranial deformation. As you can see, Tut had a flat skull, with a saddle-shaped depression on the top and underneath the skull as well. His father, Akhenaten, also had a similarly shaped skull, and it turns out his wife was drawn with a similarly elongated egg-shaped head. Not only that, all 6 daughters had a similar head shape. Sure, incest was popular back then, but given how extremely deformed they were, artificial cranial deformation is the best explanation. Still, some researchers are skeptical because there's no written evidence, but that's because it was likely done in secret. Imagine how much easier it would be to convince the population that you're special if your head looked totally different to everyone else's. They didn't want anyone to find out. Amazingly, the practice endured as mummified priests thousands of years after King Tut have also been scanned and proven to have the same subtle shape to their skull. Number 2. Ancient trap technology. Talking about the action-loving professor, there was some truth behind his far-fetched tales. Royalty of ancient Egypt did go out of their way to preserve their bodies and their treasures for the afterlife, even more than we used to think. The pyramids are complete with elaborate decoys to perplex robbers. Apart from being incredibly solid with confusing claustrophobic chambers and long, sloping pathways to concealed entrances, they also house some ingenious primitive traps. We've known this since the 19th century, but only recently had a breakthrough thanks to modern technology. Before the revelation though, let's deconstruct that small room just outside the pharaoh's burial chamber that housed a simple yet elaborate security system. It all looked quite primitive, but the system was sophisticated for its time, and Victorian explorers gave it little attention. And here, grooves were built into the wall. When the pharaoh was sealed in his tomb, 6 giant stones could be released, preventing any future thieves from grabbing the goodies. The ancient workers then slid 3 large granite blocks, bigger than the ones that fit into the grooves, down a chute to block the entrance to the passageway, essentially cutting off access to the so-called inner sanctum. Tragically, in the end, it did little to protect Khufu's tomb, as it was probably already robbed of its contents sometime between the end of Khufu's reign around 400 years after his death. Still, many Egyptologists believe that Khufu may have outwitted the looters with another tactic. In addition to the security system, the pyramid also contained 4 small shafts, 2 from the king's chamber and 2 more that originates at the queen's chamber. To investigate, in 2017, investigators from the Scan Pyramids mission used muon radiography, a technique that uses cosmic rays to detect cavities in massive structures, to scan the structure. They found a void off one of the shafts. Whether the void actually contains treasure, or whether it's the real tomb of the pharaoh himself, is unclear. But for a pharaoh that was so famous people thought of him as a god, this elaborate series of tricks only makes sense. Number 1. The pyramids looked very different. We think of the pyramids looking very much like they do today, but back in the time of the Egyptians, they appeared very different. Rather than the yellowish stone that you'll see in Giza, they were actually glistening white. This is because there used to be another layer of rock on the surface, which was made from a white Tura limestone. The blocks were carefully cut and polished, and the sun's rays bounced off this material to make them sparkle and glisten, even being visible from the moon. They fit so precisely that the surface of the pyramid would have been perfectly smooth. The stunning casing was eventually removed after being loosened by an earthquake and used to build other structures. Large amounts were taken in 1356 by Bahri Sultan Nasir ad-Din al-Hassan to build mosques and fortresses in Cairo, and more were taken in the early 1800s for further constructions in the capital. Some pieces of this limestone casing still survive though, and there's one plan to be controversially shown at the Museum of Scotland in 2019.